March 15, 2008. Reno, Nevada. A young woman's car sits abandoned in a supermarket parking lot on the edge of town. Engine cold, doors unlocked, her purse and phone resting on the passenger seat as if she'd just stepped away for a moment. But Alana Morrison never came back. And for 16 years, her family lived in the suffocating silence of not knowing. If you want to discover how cutting-edge science finally broke open this cold case and brought answers to a family that had waited nearly 2 decades for the truth, subscribe now. This is a story about persistence, technology, and the moment when justice finally catches up with evil. Stay until the end, because what happens in the final chapter will change everything you think you know about this case. Alana Morrison was 23 years old. She had long chestnut hair that caught the light when she moved, a warm smile that regulars at the Mountain View Diner remembered years later, and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She was in her 3rd year at the University of Nevada, working night shifts to pay for tuition, living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment near campus with her roommate Brenna Hayes. By all accounts, Alana was responsible, cautious, the kind of person who called her mother every Sunday without fail. That Thursday night in March started like any other. The weather was cool, typical for early spring in northern Nevada, with temperatures dropping into the 40s after sunset. Alana had worked the dinner shift at the Diner, a family-owned restaurant on South Virginia Street that served locals and travelers passing through. Her manager, a man named Robert Chen, would later tell investigators that Alana seemed perfectly normal that evening. She took orders, refilled coffee cups, laughed with the kitchen staff during her break. Nothing suggested that in a few hours, she would vanish. Robert watched Alana clock out at 10:30 p.m. She gathered her jacket, said goodnight, and walked out through the back door into the employee parking area. The security camera captured her crossing the lot, keys in hand. Then she disappeared from view. That grainy footage would be watched thousands of times over the coming years, analyzed frame by frame, searching for something, anything, that might explain what happened next. When Alana didn't show up for her Saturday morning shift, Robert assumed she was sick. When she didn't answer her phone, he figured she was sleeping off a flu. But when Brenna Hayes called him Saturday evening, her voice tight with worry, saying Alana hadn't come home and wasn't responding to anyone, the first threads of concern began to weave into something darker. Brenna filed a missing person report that night. She told the Reno Police Department everything she knew. Alana had no boyfriend, no conflicts with anyone, no reason to disappear. She hadn't packed clothes. Her textbooks were still open on her desk. Her laptop was charging by her bed. Everything suggested she'd expected to come home. Sunday morning, a patrol officer found Alana's car. It was parked at a Safeway supermarket 3 miles from the diner, sitting in a corner of the lot away from the entrance. The discovery sent a chill through the investigation team. The car wasn't hidden, but it wasn't somewhere Alana would normally go. She shopped at a different store closer to her apartment. The location made no sense. Inside the vehicle, everything appeared undisturbed. Her purse contained her wallet with $43 cash and all her credit cards. Her phone showed the battery had died sometime Friday morning. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, nothing to indicate violence had occurred in or near the car. But there was something else, something that would take years to understand its significance. Forensic technicians processed the vehicle. They lifted fingerprints, collected fiber samples, swabbed surfaces for DNA. Most of what they found belonged to Alana, which was expected, but there were other traces too. Prints that didn't match anyone in the system. Biological material so degraded and mixed that the technology of 2008 couldn't separate it into usable profiles. Detective Samuel Rivera caught the case. He was 42 years old, a veteran investigator with 15 years in homicide and missing persons. Samuel had seen terrible things in his career, but something about Alana's disappearance troubled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was how ordinary everything seemed. There was no dramatic conflict, no obvious suspect, no clear motive. Just a young woman who went to work and never made it home. The first 72 hours of a missing person investigation are critical. Samuel knew this. He assembled a team, organized search parties, contacted hospitals and homeless shelters. Volunteers combed the area around the diner and the supermarket, looking for any trace of Alana. Her face appeared on local news broadcasts. Her mother, Claire Morrison, made tearful appeals for information. Tips came in, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Alana, Friends described her as kind and dedicated. Professors said she was a strong student who never missed class. Co-workers spoke of her work ethic and gentle nature. But 3 names emerged as persons of interest. 3 men whose relationships with Alana contained friction, however slight. Ethan Caldwell worked the kitchen at Mountain View Diner. He was 26, temperamental, known for conflicts with staff. Several employees mentioned that Ethan and Alana had argued 2 weeks before her disappearance. The argument was about shift coverage, something minor, but Ethan had raised his voice and Alana had reported him to management. Ethan had been written up. He'd been angry about it. Marcus Lang was Alana's ex-boyfriend. They dated for 8 months during her sophomore year, breaking up 6 months before she vanished. Friends said Marcus hadn't handled the breakup well. He'd called repeatedly, showed up at her apartment uninvited, sent long emotional text messages. Alana had been firm but kind in her rejections, but Marcus's behavior had crossed into harassment. She'd considered getting a restraining order but decided against it, hoping he'd eventually move on. And then there was Nolan Pierce. Nolan was 34, a regular customer at the diner who came in 3 or 4 times a week. Staff had noticed his attention toward Alana. He always requested to sit in her section. He left large tips. He tried to engage her in personal conversation. Alana had mentioned to Brenna that Nolan made her uncomfortable, but she'd handled it professionally, keeping interactions brief and focused on taking orders. Samuel Rivera interviewed all 3 men in the days following Alana's disappearance. Each interview revealed details, contradictions, gaps in stories. But none provided the breakthrough the case needed. Not yet. Not for a very long time. What nobody knew in those early days of March 2008 was that the evidence to solve Alana's murder already existed. It was sitting in an evidence locker, carefully cataloged and stored, waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to extract truth from degraded biological material. Waiting 16 years for a genealogist sitting at a computer to build a family tree that would finally point to a name nobody had considered. The investigation was about to become one of the longest cold cases in Nevada history, but it was also about to become something else, a testament to the power of persistence, the evolution of forensic science, and a family's refusal to let their daughter be forgotten. 3 weeks after Alana Morrison disappeared, on a Sunday morning when the desert sun was already burning hot by 9 a.m., a group of hikers made a discovery that would transform a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The group consisted of 4 friends from Sparks, a neighboring city to Reno, who'd driven out to Virginia Range for a day of trail hiking. Virginia Range is a stretch of desert mountains east of Reno, the kind of landscape that defines Nevada. Rocky terrain, sparse vegetation, endless sky, and a silence so complete it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. The area is popular with outdoor enthusiasts, but remote enough that you can hike for hours without seeing another person. They were about 2 miles off the main trail, exploring a canyon area, when one of them noticed something that didn't belong. At first, it looked like discarded clothing caught in the brush, but as they got closer, the terrible reality became clear. They'd found human remains. The Washoe County Sheriff's Department responded within the hour. The scene was approximately 40 miles from Reno, far enough that whoever had brought a body here had wanted it hidden, had counted on the desert to keep secrets. Crime scene technicians worked carefully in the heat, photographing, measuring, collecting evidence. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, which complicated immediate identification, but certain details were preserved. Dental work, bone structure, fragments of clothing. By Tuesday morning, the forensic odontologist had confirmed what everyone feared. The dental records matched. The body was Alana Morrison. Claire Morrison received the news in her living room, with Detective Samuel Rivera sitting across from her, his voice gentle but firm as he delivered words no parent should ever hear. Claire had spent 3 weeks suspended in the agony of not knowing, clinging to desperate hope that her daughter might still be alive, might have amnesia, might be in a hospital somewhere without identification. Now that hope died, replaced by a different kind of pain. At least now she knew. At least now there could be answers. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was asphyxiation. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine the exact method, whether manual strangulation or suffocation, but the hyoid bone showed fractures consistent with compression to the neck. Alana had been murdered. There was no doubt about that. Time of death was estimated to be within 24 to 48 hours of her disappearance, meaning she'd likely died that Thursday night or early Friday morning. Evidence collected at the scene included several items that would prove crucial, though investigators didn't fully understand their significance at the time. Fibers that didn't match Alana's clothing, soil samples with unusual mineral composition, and biological material, degraded by exposure to the elements but present nonetheless, material that contained DNA from someone other than the victim. The problem was that in 2008, DNA technology had limitations. The samples were degraded, mixed, and low in quantity. Forensic labs could extract partial profiles, but these fragments weren't detailed enough to produce a match in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. The genetic information existed, but it was like having pieces of a puzzle without knowing what the final picture looked like or having enough pieces to even begin assembling it. Samuel Rivera threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that worried his wife. He worked 16-hour days, built timelines on his office wall, studied every detail of Alana's life looking for the invisible thread that would lead to her killer. The three persons of interest became the focus of intense scrutiny. Marcus Lang, the ex-boyfriend, was brought in for another interview. This time, Samuel pressed harder. Marcus's alibi for the night of Alana's disappearance was that he'd been in Las Vegas visiting friends. He provided names, addresses, a hotel receipt. Detectives drove to Vegas, interviewed the friends, checked security footage at the hotel. Everything checked out. Marcus had been in Las Vegas from Wednesday afternoon through Saturday morning. Unless he'd somehow driven back to Reno in the middle of the night, committed murder, disposed of a body, and returned to Vegas without anyone noticing, he wasn't the killer. Marcus Lang was eliminated as a suspect. Ethan Caldwell presented a different challenge. His alibi was weaker. He claimed he'd been home alone the night Alana disappeared, watching television, then going to bed around midnight. No one could confirm this. His apartment was in Northeast Reno, about 20 minutes from the diner. He owned a truck, had knowledge of the desert areas around the city from camping trips. He had a motive, however thin, anger over being written up at work because of Alana's complaint. Samuel administered a polygraph test to Ethan. The results came back inconclusive. Ethan showed physiological stress responses during certain questions, but polygraphs aren't foolproof. Stress can come from being accused of murder even if you're innocent. Ethan's lawyer advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, there wasn't enough for an arrest. Ethan remained a person of interest, but the investigation stalled. Nolan Pierce was perhaps the most enigmatic of the three. When detectives went to question him at his home, they found a man who seemed genuinely shocked by Alana's death. Nolan was an IT consultant who worked from home, a quiet man who'd moved to Reno from California 2 years earlier. He admitted he'd found Alana attractive, admitted he'd hoped to ask her out eventually, but insisted he'd never acted inappropriately. He'd simply been a regular customer who enjoyed her service. Nolan's alibi was that he'd been working on a project with a tight deadline the night Alana disappeared. His computer logs showed activity on his home network until 2 a.m. But computer logs can be faked, and Nolan had the technical knowledge to do it. His demeanor during questioning was calm, almost too calm. He answered every question without hesitation, maintained eye contact, showed what seemed like genuine sadness about Alana's death. Detective Rivera's instincts told him something was off about Nolan Pierce, but instincts aren't evidence. There was nothing concrete connecting him to the crime. No witnesses placed him near the diner that night. His vehicle, a gray Honda sedan, didn't match any vehicles seen in the area. The DNA from the crime scene didn't match Nolan's profile. 6 months after Alana's murder, Nolan moved to Arizona for a new job opportunity. He left a forwarding address and phone number. He wasn't fleeing, he was just leaving. The investigation continued through the summer and fall of 2008, but momentum was fading. Every lead had been pursued. Every piece of evidence had been analyzed with the technology available. The case wasn't officially closed, but it went cold. Samuel Rivera kept the file on his desk for months, reviewing it during lunch breaks, reading witness statements before he went home at night, searching for the detail he'd missed, the connection he'd failed to make. In 2012, advances in DNA technology prompted a re-examination of the biological evidence from the Virginia Range crime scene. New extraction methods allowed scientists to pull more genetic information from degraded samples. A more complete DNA profile was developed, but when it was run through CODIS again, there was still no match. The killer's DNA simply wasn't in the system. Another review happened in 2016, using even more sophisticated techniques. Again, a slightly better profile was obtained. Again, no match was found. It was maddening. The evidence existed, the science kept improving. But without a name in the database, all the technology in the world couldn't solve the case. Claire Morrison never gave up. Every year on the anniversary of Alana's death, she organized a vigil in Wingfield Park along the Trianni River in downtown Reno. Dozens of people would gather, light candles, share memories of Alana. Claire always ended these vigils with the same statement: "Someone knows what happened to my daughter. Someone out there has information. Please, for the love of God, come forward." But no one did. The years accumulated. 2008 became 2010, became 2015, became 2020. Alana's case file gathered dust. New detectives rotated through the department. Samuel Rivera retired in 2019, and at his retirement party, he told colleagues that failing to solve Alana Morrison's murder was the greatest regret of his career. He'd worked hundreds of cases, solved most of them, but this one haunted him. This young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and he couldn't give her family justice. What none of them knew was that the answer had been there all along, locked in those degraded DNA samples, waiting for one more technological revolution, waiting for a breakthrough that would come not from traditional law enforcement databases, but from a completely different source: the millions of people uploading their genetic information to ancestry websites, searching for long-lost relatives, building family trees, unknowingly creating a web of genetic connections that would transform criminal investigations forever. The case was cold, but it wasn't dead. And in 2023, 15 years after Alana Morrison's body was found in the Nevada desert, everything was about to change. The summer of 2023 brought record-breaking heat to northern Nevada. Temperatures in Reno reached triple digits day after day, the kind of heat that makes asphalt shimmer and distant mountains dissolve into haze. But inside the climate-controlled offices of the Reno Police Department, something else was heating up: renewed hope for solving cold cases that had frustrated investigators for years. In June, the department received a grant from the Nevada State Legislature specifically designated for cold case investigations. The funding was substantial, earmarked for utilizing cutting-edge forensic technologies that hadn't been available when many of these cases were originally investigated. Among those technologies was forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had exploded into public consciousness over the previous 5 years after solving several high-profile cold cases across the country. Detective Lauren Vega was assigned to the cold case unit. She was 36 years old, had been with the department for 11 years, and had a reputation for meticulous work and stubborn persistence. When she reviewed the list of cases that might benefit from genetic genealogy analysis, Alana Morrison's name caught her attention immediately. The case had strong DNA evidence, a clear chain of custody, and a family still desperately seeking closure. It seemed like an ideal candidate. Lauren pulled the complete case file, spending an entire weekend reading through 15 years of investigation reports, witness statements, forensic analyses, and dead-end leads. She studied crime scene photographs, reviewed the timeline Samuel Rivera had constructed, examined every detail of the evidence collected from Virginia Range. The more she read, the more convinced she became that this case could be solved. The killer had left biological evidence. That evidence contained his identity. It was just a matter of extracting it properly and finding the right way to connect those genetic markers to a name. The first step was sending the preserved DNA samples to Othram, a private laboratory in Texas that specialized in forensic-grade genome sequencing. Unlike traditional DNA testing that looked at specific markers, Othram's technology could sequence entire genomes from incredibly small or degraded samples. The process was expensive, which was why the grant funding was crucial, but the results could be transformative. The samples from Alana's case arrived at Othram's facility in July. Scientists there used proprietary techniques to extract and amplify the genetic material, building a comprehensive DNA profile that included hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. By September, they had something usable, a profile complete enough to upload to genetic genealogy databases. This is where forensic genetic genealogy diverged from traditional DNA databases like CODIS. CODIS contained profiles from convicted offenders and crime scene evidence, maybe 15 million profiles total. But websites like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA contained genetic information from millions of ordinary people who'd taken consumer ancestry tests and uploaded their results. searching for relatives or building family trees. These people had no idea their genetic information might one day help solve crimes, but they'd agreed to terms of service that allowed law enforcement access under specific circumstances. The DNA profile from Alana Morrison's killer was uploaded to GEDmatch in late September. Then came the waiting. Genetic genealogy isn't instant. The system has to search through millions of profiles, looking for segments of DNA that match, calculating the degree of relationship between the unknown killer and the people in the database. 3 weeks later, a notification came through. A match had been found. Not a direct match, which would have been extraordinarily lucky, but a partial match indicating a distant relative. The shared DNA suggested this person and the killer were approximately third cousins, meaning they shared great-great-grandparents. This is where the real investigative work began. Lauren Vega connected with a forensic genetic genealogist named Dr. Rebecca Hartman, a specialist who worked with law enforcement agencies across the country. Rebecca's job was to take that single genetic connection and work backward through generations of family history, building a tree that would eventually point to a specific individual. Dr. Hartman started with the match from GEDmatch, a woman named Patricia Brennan who lived in Oregon and had uploaded her DNA results, hoping to learn more about her Irish ancestry. Patricia had no criminal history, no connection to Nevada, and had never heard of Alana Morrison. She was simply someone whose great-great-grandparents happened to also be the great-great-grandparents of a killer. Using Patricia's family tree as a starting point, Rebecca began constructing a larger genealogical map. She accessed public records, census data, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, obituaries, and historical documents. She built out Patricia's tree, identifying all the descendants of those shared great-great-grandparents, creating branches that spread across multiple states and several generations. This process took months. Every branch had to be verified, every connection confirmed through documentation. By December, Rebecca had identified a cluster of individuals who fit the profile. They were male, the right age to have been adults in 2008, and had some connection to Nevada, but there were still dozens of possibilities. The tree needed to be refined further. One name that emerged during this process was Julian Mercer. He appeared on a branch that traced back to the shared ancestors through his paternal line. Julian was 54 years old in 2023, which meant he would have been 39 at the time of Alana's murder. Public records showed he currently lived in Sparks, Nevada, just a few miles from Reno. This was the first time Julian Mercer's name had ever come up in connection with the case. He'd never been interviewed. He'd never been a person of interest. He'd been completely invisible to the original investigation, living his life in plain sight while Alana's family suffered and investigators chased suspects who turned out to be wrong. Lauren Vega ran a background check on Julian Mercer. What she found was chilling in its ordinariness. Julian had no criminal record. He'd lived in Nevada his entire adult life. He'd been married for 12 years before divorcing in 2015. He had a daughter who was now 27. He worked in delivery logistics, had worked in that field for decades. On paper, he was unremarkable, just another middle-aged man living a quiet life in suburban Nevada. But there was one detail that made Lauren's pulse quicken. In 2008, Julian had worked for a food distribution company called High Desert Provisions. The company delivered supplies to restaurants and food service businesses throughout the Reno-Sparks area. Lauren pulled up the company's client list from that year. Mountain View Diner was one of their regular accounts. Julian Mercer had been making deliveries to the diner where Alana Morrison worked. He would have seen her, interacted with her, known her schedule, and nobody had ever questioned him because nobody had known to look at delivery drivers. The original investigation had focused on people with obvious connections to Alana, co-workers, the ex-boyfriend, regular customers. But what about the man who showed up with boxes of frozen food and canned goods, who made small talk while unloading his truck? Who was part of the background of the restaurant's daily operation? Lauren needed to confirm Julian was actually working deliveries during the relevant time period. She contacted High Desert Provisions, which had since been acquired by a larger company, and requested employment records and delivery logs from 2008. Corporate policy required they maintain these records for 15 years for tax and liability purposes. After some bureaucratic delays, the documents arrived. Julian Mercer had indeed worked for High Desert Provisions in March 2008. He'd been a full-time delivery driver, and here was the detail that sent chills down Lauren's spine. The company's GPS tracking system, installed in all delivery vehicles for route optimization, had recorded his movements. On March 15, 2008, the night Alana disappeared, Julian had made a delivery to Mountain View Diner at 9:45 p.m. According to the GPS logs, his truck had remained in the area until 10:55 p.m., 25 minutes after Alana left work. Lauren brought this information to her lieutenant. They discussed next steps. The genetic genealogy connection was compelling, but not definitive. Julian could still be a coincidence, a distant relative of the actual killer who happened to work near the victim. They needed more. They needed Julian's actual DNA to compare directly to the crime scene evidence. The decision was made to conduct surveillance and obtain what's called an abandoned DNA sample. This is a legal technique where investigators collect genetic material that a person discards in public, material they've relinquished any expectation of privacy over. A coffee cup thrown in a trash can, a cigarette butt, a napkin used and discarded. These items can be legally collected and tested without a warrant. For 3 weeks in January 2024, detectives followed Julian Mercer. They watched him go to work, run errands, eat lunch at various restaurants. They were waiting for the right opportunity, a moment when they could collect something he'd used and discarded without contamination from other sources. The opportunity came on a cold Tuesday morning. Julian stopped at a Starbucks near his workplace, ordered a large coffee, sat at an outdoor table for 15 minutes while he scrolled through his phone, then threw the empty cup in a public trash receptacle and drove away. 2 detectives waited until he was gone, then retrieved the cup, carefully placing it in an evidence bag. The cup was sent to the Nevada State Crime Lab. Technicians swabbed the drinking rim, extracted DNA, and created a profile. Then they compared that profile to the DNA from the Virginia Range crime scene, the genetic material that had been carefully preserved for 16 years. The match came back with a probability statistic that made the case. The DNA from Julian Mercer's coffee cup matched the DNA from Alana Morrison's murder scene with a certainty of 99.9%. The odds that this DNA belonged to someone other than Julian were approximately 1 in 8 trillion. They had him. After 16 years, they finally had him. The arrest warrant for Julian Mercer was signed on a Thursday morning in late April 2024. Detective Lauren Vega assembled a tactical team for the operation, not because they expected violence, but because after 16 years of waiting, nothing could go wrong. This had to be perfect. They arrived at Julian's residence in Sparks at 6 a.m., just as the sun was rising over the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west. The house was a modest, single-story ranch-style home on a quiet street lined with similar houses. Julian's pickup truck sat in the driveway. Lights were on inside, visible through drawn curtains. He was home. Lauren knocked on the door, warrant in hand, her heart pounding despite years of experience. When Julian opened it, still in his pajamas with a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression was one of complete confusion. He looked at the assembled officers, at Lauren's badge, and asked what was happening. His voice was calm, genuinely puzzled, with no hint of panic or recognition that his decades-old secret was about to be exposed. "Julian Mercer, you're under arrest for the murder of Alana Morrison." Lauren spoke the words clearly, professionally, while officers moved past Julian into the house to secure it. Julian's face went blank. For several seconds he stood frozen, coffee cup still raised halfway to his mouth, processing what he'd just heard. Then he set the cup down carefully on a table near the door and held out his wrists for handcuffs without saying a word. The silence was eerie. Most suspects react when arrested for murder. They protest innocence, demand lawyers, ask questions, show emotion. Julian did none of these things. He simply stood there as officers cuffed him, read him his Miranda rights, and led him to a waiting patrol car. His face had gone pale but remained expressionless, as if he'd retreated somewhere deep inside himself, where detectives couldn't follow. While Julian was being transported to the police station, forensic teams began executing the search warrant on his house. They worked systematically through every room, photographing, cataloging, collecting potential evidence. The house was neat, almost obsessively organized. Everything had its place. The kitchen was clean. The living room contained minimal furniture arranged with geometric precision. In the bedroom, investigators found a filing cabinet. Inside were folders organized alphabetically, containing tax returns, utility bills, car maintenance records, medical documents. Julian was clearly someone who kept meticulous records. And in the back of the bottom drawer, underneath folders labeled with years dating back to the 1990s, they found something that changed everything. It was a journal. Not a diary with daily entries, but a sporadic collection of writings spanning nearly 3 decades. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the observations disturbingly detailed. Julian had been documenting his thoughts about women he encountered in his daily life. Not all women, but specific ones who caught his attention in ways he described with clinical precision. There were dozens of entries: a cashier at a grocery store in 1997, a receptionist at a medical office in 2003, a neighbor who'd lived 2 houses down in 2011. Julian wrote about their physical appearance, their routines, his fantasies involving them. Most entries ended there, just observations and thoughts, but some went further. And then investigators found the entry dated March 16, 2008, one day after Alana Morrison disappeared. The entry was longer than most, more detailed, written in what seemed like a state of heightened emotion, based on the slightly less controlled handwriting. The words were chilling. Julian wrote about the waitress with the chestnut hair, describing details of her appearance that matched Alana perfectly. He wrote about watching her during his deliveries to the diner, about the way she moved between tables, about the sound of her voice. And then the entry shifted into something darker. He described following her after her shift ended, waiting in the parking lot, approaching her near her car. He described her fear when she realized what was happening. He described what came next in language that was both euphemistic and unmistakably clear about what he'd done. But here's where the first major twist emerged, the detail that investigators didn't expect and that would reshape their entire understanding of the case. At the end of the entry, Julian had written something that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Alana's murder. He wrote, "She wasn't the first, and I knew even then she wouldn't be the last. The desert keeps secrets better than people do." Lauren Vega read those words standing in Julian's bedroom, evidence techs working around her, and felt ice spread through her chest. She wasn't the first. The implication was staggering. They'd been investigating Alana Morrison's murder as an isolated incident. A terrible crime, yes, but a single event. Now Julian's own words suggested something far worse. Investigators immediately began cross-referencing unsolved murders and missing persons cases in Nevada and surrounding states dating back decades. They focused on young women who'd disappeared or been found dead in circumstances similar to Alana's. The search parameters were specific: victims in their 20s, cases involving strangulation or asphyxiation, bodies found in remote desert locations, crimes that had gone unsolved. By the end of the week, they'd identified 7 cases that fit the pattern. 7 women across Nevada, California, and Arizona, spanning from 1998 to 2014. 7 investigations that had gone cold. 7 families who'd never received answers. And now there was a possibility, terrifying but real, that all 7 were connected to the man sitting in an interrogation room who refused to speak without his attorney present. The case that began as justice for Alana Morrison had just become something much larger. Julian Mercer wasn't just a killer. He might be a serial killer who'd operated undetected for over 15 years, hiding behind an ordinary job and an unremarkable life, using the vast emptiness of the American Southwest to dispose of his victims. And the most disturbing question now facing investigators was this: if Julian had killed 8 women they knew about, how many others were there that they hadn't found yet? How many bodies were still out there in the desert, waiting to be discovered? How many families were still waiting for daughters who would never come home? The revelation that Julian Mercer might be responsible for multiple murders transformed the investigation into something unprecedented in Nevada law enforcement history. A task force was assembled within 48 hours, pulling detectives from multiple jurisdictions, coordinating with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and establishing a command center dedicated solely to understanding the full scope of Julian's crimes. The journal became the roadmap. Forensic linguists and criminal psychologists analyzed every entry, looking for coded references, patterns, or admissions that might point to additional victims. The entries were disturbing not just for their content, but for their tone. Julian wrote about these women with a detached curiosity, as if he were observing specimens rather than human beings. There was no remorse, no moral wrestling, just documentation of his thoughts and actions presented with the emotional flatness of someone recording the weather. Investigators worked backward through the 7 identified cases, re-examining evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. In 3 of those cases, biological evidence had been preserved. DNA samples were sent for testing. Within 2 weeks, results came back on 2 of them, positive matches to Julian Mercer. 2 more families would finally have answers. 2 more cold cases would be solved. The number of confirmed victims rose from 1 to 3, but Julian himself remained silent. His attorney, a public defender named Thomas Brennan, who'd been assigned to the case, advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. During interrogations, Julian sat motionless, hands folded on the table, staring at a point on the wall behind the detectives' heads. He didn't ask questions. He didn't deny anything. He simply existed in that room like a piece of furniture, offering nothing. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michelle Reyes, faced a strategic decision. They had overwhelming evidence for Alana Morrison's murder: DNA, the journal entry, GPS records placing Julian near the crime scene, genetic genealogy connecting him definitively. That case was solid, provable beyond reasonable doubt. The other cases were more complicated. Some had DNA matches, others had circumstantial connections through the journal, but building individual prosecutions for each would take years and wasn't guaranteed to succeed. Michelle made the call to proceed with charges only for the 3 murders where DNA evidence provided concrete proof: Alana Morrison, Diana Chen from 2001, and Kimberly Vasquez from 2006. 3 counts of first-degree murder. 3 families who would see their day in court. The preliminary hearing in June 2024 drew national media attention. Court TV covered it live. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing the evidence. The courtroom was packed with journalists, families of the victims, and members of the public who'd followed the case since Alana's disappearance 16 years earlier. Julian appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit, his expression unchanged from the blank affect he'd maintained since his arrest. He stood when the judge entered, sat when instructed, responded to procedural questions with single-word answers. Yes, he understood the charges. Yes, he understood his rights. No, he had no questions. His demeanor was so unnaturally calm that several observers later described it as robotic, as if the human part of him had shut down completely. Claire Morrison sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by victim advocates and family members. She was 68 now, her hair gray, her face carved with lines of grief that had accumulated over 16 years. When the judge read the charges related to Alana's murder, Claire closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. This moment, this validation that her daughter's killer had finally been identified and would face justice, was something she'd waited for through thousands of painful days. But there was no joy in it, only a terrible, exhausted relief. The prosecution presented their evidence during the preliminary hearing. They explained the genetic genealogy process, walking the judge through how a distant cousin's DNA test had led them to Julian. They presented the GPS records from 2008. They showed photographs of the journal entries, Julian's own handwriting documenting his crimes. Expert witnesses testified about DNA match probabilities. The evidence was methodical, scientific, and utterly damning. Thomas Brennan, Julian's attorney, made a tactical decision not to contest the DNA evidence itself. It was unassailable. Instead, he signaled that the defense would focus on mental competency and psychological state. He requested a full psychiatric evaluation of Julian, suggesting that his client's affect and behavior indicated serious mental illness that might impact his ability to stand trial or his culpability at the time of the crimes. The judge ordered the evaluation and bound Julian over for trial on all 3 murder counts. Bail was denied. Julian was remanded to the Washoe County Detention Facility to await trial, which was scheduled for September. Over the summer, forensic psychiatrists spent dozens of hours with Julian. The results of their evaluation, when finally submitted to the court, were disturbing. Julian was found competent to stand trial. He understood the proceedings, could assist in his defense, and showed no signs of psychosis or detachment from reality. But the psychiatrists noted something else. Julian exhibited characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder and extreme compartmentalization. He was capable of functioning normally in society, while simultaneously harboring violent impulses and acting on them without remorse. He wasn't insane in the legal sense. He was simply someone who'd built his entire life around maintaining a facade of normalcy, while periodically killing women when the opportunity arose. As September approached and the trial date drew near, investigators continued working on the other 4 unsolved cases that fit Julian's pattern. They were building evidence, interviewing witnesses from decades ago, searching for any additional proof that might allow them to bring charges for those victims too. The families of those 4 women lived in a painful limbo, believing Julian had killed their daughters but unable to prove it definitively, unable to access the closure that Alana's, Diana's, and Kimberly's families would receive. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and finally deliver justice that had been delayed for far too long. The trial of Julian Mercer began on September 9, 2024, in a packed courtroom at the Washoe County Courthouse in downtown Reno. Security was tight, with metal detectors and additional deputies stationed throughout the building. The jury had been carefully selected over 2 weeks, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67, representing a cross-section of northern Nevada residents who would now be tasked with deciding Julian's fate. Deputy District Attorney Michelle Reyes opened with a statement that was both precise and emotionally resonant. She told the jury about 3 young women who'd had their lives stolen by the defendant. Alana Morrison, 23, who'd dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Diana Chen, 25, a graphic designer who disappeared after leaving work in 2001. Kimberly Vasquez, 22, a nursing student who'd vanished in 2006. 3 women whose only connection was that they'd crossed paths with Julian Mercer, and that intersection had cost them everything. Michelle methodically laid out the evidence. She called 23 witnesses over the course of 2 weeks. DNA experts explained how genetic genealogy had identified Julian as a suspect, then how direct DNA comparison had confirmed his presence at each crime scene. The testimony was technical but devastating. The probability that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Julian was so astronomically small that it was functionally impossible. Forensic technicians testified about the journal found in Julian's home. The journal itself was entered into evidence, and selected passages were read aloud in court. The courtroom fell into heavy silence as Julian's own words described his crimes. Several jurors visibly reacted, faces tightening with disgust or horror. Claire Morrison wept quietly, her shoulders shaking as she heard the clinical detail with which this man had documented her daughter's final moments. GPS records from High Desert Provisions showed Julian's delivery truck near the Mountain View Diner on March 15, 2008, placing him at the scene during the time frame when Alana disappeared. Similar location data and witness testimony connected him to the areas where Diana and Kimberly had last been seen. The prosecution built a timeline for each murder, showing opportunity, means, and physical evidence that tied Julian conclusively to all 3 crimes. The defense called only 2 witnesses, the forensic psychiatrists who'd evaluated Julian. Thomas Brennan's strategy was not to claim innocence, but to argue for life in prison rather than the death penalty, by emphasizing Julian's psychological disorders. The psychiatrists testified about Julian's antisocial personality traits, his inability to form genuine emotional connections, his compartmentalized thinking that allowed him to separate his crimes from his everyday identity. But this strategy had limited impact. The jury wasn't being asked to determine if Julian was mentally ill. They were being asked if he'd committed murder, and the evidence was overwhelming. Julian's psychological state might explain why he'd done these things, but it didn't excuse them or create reasonable doubt about his guilt. Julian himself never took the stand. He sat at the defense table throughout the trial with the same blank expression he'd worn since his arrest, occasionally conferring with his attorney in whispered conversations, but otherwise motionless. The families of his victims, seated in the gallery, watched him with expressions ranging from grief to rage to exhausted sadness. He never looked at them. He never showed any acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. The prosecution rested after presenting their case. The defense rested 2 days later. Closing arguments were delivered, final instructions given to the jury. On October 7, 2024, after deliberating for 11 hours across 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was read aloud by the jury foreman, a retired teacher named Margaret Walsh, whose voice was steady and clear. As each guilty verdict was announced, family members in the gallery reacted. Some wept. Some nodded silently. Claire Morrison closed her eyes and whispered something that looked like a prayer. Julian showed no reaction. He sat with the same impassive expression as the verdicts were read, as if he were hearing about someone else's crimes rather than his own. The only change was a slight tightening around his jaw, barely noticeable, a tiny crack in his carefully maintained facade. But the trial's conclusion wasn't the end of the story. It was in the sentencing phase 3 weeks later. that the final and most devastating twist would emerge. The sentencing hearing allowed victim impact statements. Claire Morrison spoke first. She approached the podium slowly, holding a photograph of Alana taken 6 months before her death. In the picture, Alana was laughing, her chestnut hair catching sunlight, her whole face bright with youth and possibility. Claire spoke for 12 minutes about what Alana's murder had stolen from their family. Not just Alana's future, but Claire's future too. The grandchildren she'd never have. The decades of memories that would never be created. The hole in her life that could never be filled. Diana Chen's parents spoke next, their words delivered through a translator since English was their second language. They described the years of not knowing, the torture of hoping their daughter might still be alive somewhere, the awful finality of learning the truth. Kimberly Vasquez's sister, Elena, spoke about growing up without her best friend, about the survivor's guilt that haunted her, about the anger that never quite went away. Then something unexpected happened. The judge received a request from the prosecution to call one additional witness before sentencing. Michelle Reyes stood and explained that during the trial, investigators had continued working on the other unsolved cases connected to Julian's journal. They'd made a breakthrough in one of them, a case from 2014 involving a woman named Rachel Owens who disappeared from Carson City and whose body had never been found. A search team had been dispatched to an area of the desert near Silver Springs, guided by references in Julian's journal that investigators had decoded. Just 3 days earlier, they'd found remains. Dental records confirmed the identity, Rachel Owens, and DNA evidence recovered from the burial site matched Julian Mercer. But here's where the final, most shocking revelation came. When investigators conducted a more thorough excavation of the area, searching for any additional evidence, they found something else. They found more bodies. Not one, not two, but 5 additional sets of remains, all in various stages of decomposition or skeletal preservation, buried in the desert within a quarter-mile radius. 5 women who'd never been reported missing or whose disappearances had been attributed to voluntary flight. Runaways, women who'd fallen through the cracks of society and whose absence hadn't triggered investigations. The courtroom erupted in shock. Journalists scrambled to update their live coverage. Family members in the gallery gasped or cried out. Even the judge looked stunned, asking for clarification. Michelle repeated the information clearly. Julian Mercer wasn't responsible for 3 murders or 8 murders. He was responsible for at least 11 murders spanning more than 20 years, possibly more that hadn't yet been discovered. Julian's expression finally changed. For the first time since his arrest, emotion flickered across his face. Not remorse or shame, but something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if some part of him was pleased that the full scope of what he'd done was finally being acknowledged. It lasted only a moment before his features settled back into blankness, but everyone in that courtroom saw it. They saw the truth of who Julian Mercer really was, a man who'd built a secret empire of death while living an unremarkable life, a man who'd killed repeatedly and would have continued killing if genetic genealogy hadn't finally caught up with him. The judge, clearly shaken by this revelation, called for a recess to consider the new information. When court reconvened 2 hours later, he delivered his sentence. Julian Mercer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 3 counts of first-degree murder, sentences to be served consecutively. Additional charges would be filed for the other victims as investigations concluded, and evidence was processed. Julian was led out of the courtroom in shackles. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, dying eventually in a prison cell, his name forever associated with one of Nevada's most prolific serial killers. The families of his known victims would have some measure of justice, though it could never restore what they'd lost. And investigators would continue searching the desert, looking for more remains, trying to identify every victim, giving names back to the nameless dead. After the sentencing, Detective Lauren Vega held a press conference outside the courthouse. She spoke about the power of persistence, about how advances in DNA technology and the willingness of millions of people to share their genetic information for genealogy purposes had created a new tool for solving cold cases. She thanked the original investigators, especially retired Detective Samuel Rivera, who was present at the sentencing and who'd never given up hope that Alana's case would be solved. Samuel, now 69 years old, spoke briefly to reporters. His voice was thick with emotion. He said he'd carried Alana Morrison's case in his heart for 16 years, that he'd felt like he'd failed her and her family by not solving it before he retired. Now finally, there was justice. It was incomplete justice. Justice that came far too late, but it was something. And for the families who'd waited in anguish for years or decades, that something meant everything. Claire Morrison gave one final interview as she left the courthouse that day. She was asked how she felt now that her daughter's killer had been sentenced. She paused for a long time before answering, choosing her words carefully. She said she didn't feel joy or satisfaction, only a deep, profound exhaustion. The verdict couldn't bring Alana back. It couldn't restore the life that had been stolen, but it could provide a period at the end of a sentence that had been left hanging for 16 terrible years. She could finally lay her daughter to rest knowing that the truth was known, and the person responsible would never hurt anyone else. The case of Alana Morrison's murder, which began on a cold March night in 2008, when a young woman disappeared from a diner parking lot, had finally reached its conclusion. But it also opened up a larger story about the women whose disappearances had been overlooked, whose cases had gone cold not because they were unsolvable, but because society hadn't valued them enough to keep looking. It raised questions about how many other Julian Mercers might be out there, living ordinary lives while harboring dark secrets, and whether advances in forensic science could finally bring them to justice. "The desert keeps secrets," Julian had written in his journal, "but not forever, not anymore." Science and persistence and the dedication of investigators who refused to let the dead be forgotten had proven that even the most carefully hidden crimes could eventually be exposed. DNA doesn't lie. Family trees, built innocently by people researching their ancestry, could become roadmaps to justice, and victims who'd been silent for years could finally speak through the genetic code they'd left behind. If this story has moved you, if you believe that every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed, subscribe to this channel now. We'll continue bringing you these investigations, these stories of persistence and breakthrough, these moments when science and dedication finally deliver answers to families who've waited in anguish. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about this case. And watch our next episode, because there are more cold cases being solved right now, more families receiving closure, more proof that justice, however delayed, can still prevail. The work continues. The search for truth never stops. And every victim, every single one, deserves to be remembered and honored.